The title of our message this morning, Job chapter 19, verses 1 to 29, Job's sixth speech. Job's sixth speech, our introduction. In last week's text, we heard Bildad's second speech in the second cycle of speeches. Bildad made a very similar argument to his first argument in chapter, I believe it was 8. Bildad is the truest believer in the doctrine of retribution, which that every man gets exactly what he deserves. If a man suffers, it's because he's a sinner. He does not fool God regardless of his outward piety. Those who prosper do so because they are righteous. In Bildad's mind, Job is a secret sinner. There is no way to explain why God would punish him so severely. Here we have Job's complete answer to Bildad in chapter 19. There are 5 points to our message this morning. Did you get a bulletin? Okay. Would you give her a bulletin? Sorry about that. There are 5 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 6, Job addresses his friends. Verses 7 through 20, Job's complaint. Verses 21 through 22, Job addresses his friends again. Verses 23 through 27, Job's wish, belief, and desire. And then verses 28 to 29, Job again addresses his friends. And as you can see, the text this morning follows the pattern of A, B, A, C, A. A chiastic pattern. In parts 1, 3, and 5, Job addresses his friends. In between his speech to his friends, he complains to God of his physical and emotional demise, and then offers his great hope that if he cannot vindicate himself, then some other Redeemer would do so for him. We come to our first point. Verses 1 to 6, Job addresses his friends. Verses 1 and 2. But Job answered and said, "How long will ye vex my soul and torment me with words?" As you can read, and as I'm sure you've noticed, all the speakers are now making it a habit to begin their speeches with a counter insult. It is obvious that both sides are losing patience with each other. Here Job addresses all three friends in anger more than in his previous sorrow. It is obvious to the reader that this debate will have no end until both sides can agree on the original premise. Job's original premise, he interprets God as being overharsh of a blameless and innocent sinner. And of course his friends interpret his demise as the wrath of God poured out upon a hypocrite. And that's both their starting points. They can't agree. Both argue from their own premise and reject the other's premise. Job begins by asking, "How long will ye vex my soul?" Or "How long will you continue to treat me like a hypocritical sinner?" He asks, "When will the humiliation," here he uses the word torment, "of listening to continually flawed lectures end?" Verses 3 to 6, he goes on. "Ye have now," speaking to his friends, 10 times reproached me, and are not ashamed. You are impudent toward me. And though I had indeed erred, mine error remaineth with me. But indeed, if ye will advance yourselves against me, and rebuke me for my reproach, know now that God hath overthrown me, and hath compassed me with his net." Job continues here to accuse his three friends. He accuses them of their constant barrage of humiliating accusations. Job says, "Ye have now 10 times reproached me, and are not ashamed." Now the word 10 often stands for the full measure of something, as we see in Numbers 14:21, Genesis 31:7, Leviticus 26:26. In other words, his friends have fully tried to humiliate him. Job, of course, cannot be humiliated personally until he admits his guilt. However, the attempts of the friends to humiliate Job, according to Job, should make them ashamed, not him. It is the person acting shamefully, according to Job, who should be humiliated, not the person being wrongfully humiliated. Job does not understand why his friends feel so compelled to make him into a wicked sinner. Job has done nothing to harm his friends personally, yet they seem to go on for no other reason but to harm him. They make themselves into the victim of some great crime. But Job asks, why do you make yourselves the victim? It is I who suffers. That's what he says. Mine error remaineth with me. Job says, but if you really want to find someone to blame, or as he says, advance yourselves towards me, if you have to find someone to blame, even if there's nothing but minor faults in me, you still want to blame me, because he says, and though I indeed have erred, he admits to minor faults, I am nothing more than an innocent sufferer. I'm not the person to blame for my calamities. Job says, the cause of these torments is not me and my imperfection sins. The cause of my torments is with God. Job is not accusing God here of wrongdoing. He simply points out that it is God that's created his situation, not his sin. The situation is not a result of Job's sins, since it was God who took away his possessions and family. And since the friends insist on using God's treatment of Job as evidence of his guilt, then in order to find the cause of Job's suffering, they must turn to God for answers, not to Job. Only God knows why Job is suffering. How could Job know why God makes a blameless man suffer? For Job, it is God that has created a catch-22 situation. And here's the catch-22. If Job accepts his suffering, he proves that he's a sinner. If he doesn't accept his suffering, he makes himself into a sinner by questioning God's judgment. He's in a catch-22. He can't get out of that trap with his friends. We come to our second point, verses 7 through 20, Job's complaint. Behold, I cry out of violence, but I have none answer. I cry, but there is no judgment. Now that Job has demanded that his friends ask God why he suffers, for Job has no idea why he suffers, he begins to show how he suffers, both physically in verses 7 through 12 and emotionally in verses 13 through 20. Job here acts almost like a man being mugged on the street. He cries out for help. He says, I cry. But it is not a cry for deliverance. It's a cry for vindication. That's what he wants. Vindication from God. The problem with God making Job look like he is being punished for sin is that everyone assumes he's a sinner and cannot look at him any other way. Job cries for justice, but he says he receives no answer. As it says in the text, there is no judgment. Now here in verses 8 through 12, Job is going to show how God has made him to suffer physically. Here's what it says. He hath hedged up my way that I cannot pass, and he hath set darkness in my paths. He hath spoiled me of mine honor, and taken the crown away from mine head. He hath destroyed me on every side, and I am gone, and he hath removed mine hope like a tree. And he hath kindled his wrath against me, and counted me as one of his enemies. His armies came together and made their way upon me, and camped about my tabernacles. As you can tell, there's a whole series of metaphors. And so let's look at each metaphor individually quickly. Job sets out to describe his hopeless situation, of course, in a series of metaphors. In verse 8, he's like a man walking along a path, just walking through life. And for some bizarre reason, the path is blocked by a wall or a hedge, so that he cannot pass, or in this essence, get on with his life. He's stuck. And worse yet, darkness approaches, so that he has no idea what to do. He is stuck in the shadow of the wall, which stands for the fact that he's stuck in the shadow of death. And that's why he says, he has set darkness in my paths. Now he moves to another metaphor, not related to the first metaphor, but showing the hopelessness of his case physically. In verse 9, Job is like an honored person, because Job did once wear his honor like a garment. But Job, we notice, is visited with calamity, and now he must exchange his royal clothes for sackcloth. He is now clothed with shame, and the crown of his blameless honor he once wore proudly has been taken from him, and he has no honor among the people. In verse 10, we have what we might call a mixed metaphor. At first, Job is compared to a building that is attacked from every side, just as Job's calamities came from each direction on the day his family was destroyed. until his building was demolished. In this same metaphor, Job is pictured as a tree, which is a more hopeless metaphor than a demolished building. A building can be rebuilt, but a tree, once it is torn up by the roots, must die and cannot be revived. Job here imagines himself as worse than a building that's fallen down. He imagines himself as an uprooted tree, left to only rot and die with no hope of future life. In verse 11, Job laments that God has shown him nothing but anger, but for some unknown reason. God seemingly grows angrier at Job with the passing of each humiliating day, so that somehow Job has gone from a blameless servant, regularly receiving the blessings of God, to an enemy of God with God's hot, here called kindled, wrath against him. Finally, in verse 12, God is pictured as having assembled a great army against Job. Job is described as if he were a city about to be besieged by an army. But in the end, God's great army does not attack a big city, but just Job's little tent, or as he calls it, my tabernacle. Job wants to show the disproportionate actions of God towards his trifling sins. Each of these metaphors highlighted Job's physical suffering. He has been physically hedged, dishonored, attacked, and uprooted. Now in verse 13 to 20, sticking to the same theme that God is the one that's the cause of all his troubles, he showed how God physically hurt him. Now he's going to show how God has emotionally hurt him by removing all people from him. Verses 13 to 20. He hath removed my brethren far from me, and also mine acquaintance were strangers unto me. My neighbors have forsaken me, and my familiars have forgotten me. They that dwell in my house and my maids took me for a stranger, for I was a stranger in their sight. I called my servant, but he would not answer, though I prayed him with my mouth. My breath was strange unto my wife, though I prayed her for the children's sake of mine own body. The wicked also despised me, and when I rose they spake against me. All my secret friends abhorred me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped with the skin of my teeth. As I mentioned in this second section in which Job complains to his friends, he moves away from the general metaphors that describe his current state to very personal examples of his emotional suffering. In the first group, verses 7 through 12, Job suffered through violent physical action. In these verses, verses 13 to 20, it's violence against the emotions and the loss of companionship. Let's look at these verses. Job, of course, aims his complaint directly at God. After all, it is God that has caused him to lose all intimacy with humans. God may have used secondary causes, but that is no matter to Job. He believes that God is the cause of his misery. For after all, second causes are still directly affected by God. Job first laments in verse 13 the loss of his immediate and extended family. He calls them his brethren. For he has either lost them to death or they ignore him. As he says, they had become strangers to me. In verse 14, and we see in each of these verses the loss of more and more companionship. In verse 14, it becomes his nearest neighbors or nearest acquaintances who have forsaken me and forgotten me. They have avoided him, given him the cold shoulder, or flatly refused to speak with him. Even worse, those he employed, his servants and his maids, those he says that dwell in mine house, are ignoring Job. They took him for a stranger, the text says. They would not answer, the text says, or answer the pleas of Job. Job says, though I prayed him, my servant, with my mouth. In other words, though I said, ask my servant to do something, he said no. Those who were employed by Job to serve him now ignore him, even adding more to his lack of companionship and more to his humiliation. Job goes on to speak broadly and metaphorically of the effect of his life on even his own wife. Verse 17. When Job says, my breath was strange unto my wife, he's not referring to his physical breath, as if he had bad breath, but the breath should be taken as his life in general. In other words, my life has become a stink to her. His life and existence have become repulsive to even his own wife. She still would rather see him dead than alive, as she spoke in Job 2:9, curse God and die. It goes on. Even the children of his own servants, here in verse 18, who once treated him with respect and reverence, now look upon him with disdain. All walks of life have disassociated themselves from Job. Why? Because they believe it is their duty to either mistreat him until he repents or participate in his punishment by shunning him as an entire community. Finally, in verse 19 of this point, Job has been socially dismissed by his own circle of friends. This includes his secret friends, who might be those whom he spoke privately on private concerns. Even they have come to abhor Job. And generally all those who Job showed love over the course of his life have chosen to not return that love, but to turn against Job. Job says that he has not grown sick and weary from the outside in, as do most people who die of their old age when their organs fail them, or they have a general weakness of the bones. Job, on the other hand, says he has died from the inside out. He says, my bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh. That's the opposite of what you expected to say. In other words, the calamity and violence to his emotions have killed him unnaturally inward before his own body wore out. The emotional demise of Job has sapped him of life so that he has died emotionally within before he has died physically without. We come to our third point, verses 21 and 22. Job again addresses his friends. Verses 21 and 22, he turns to his friends and he says this, have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. Why do you persecute me as God and are not satisfied with my flesh? Here in this second address to his friends in chapter 19, Job speaks in a completely new tone from anywhere else in the whole book of Job. Job actually asks for his friends' pity. He says, have pity upon me. Never before has Job requested pity from his friends. Job has berated his friends for their treachery, chapter 6, verse 5, for their callousness, chapter 6, 27, for their stupidity, chapter 12, 2 and 3, and 13, 2. He has berated them for their worthlessness, chapter 13, verse 4. He's berated them for their lies, chapter 13, verse 7. For their partisanship, chapter 13, verses 7 to 9. And for their torture, chapter 19, verse 2. And their attempts to destroy him, again, chapter 19, verse 2. And now, after all this criticism of his friends, for the first time he asks for pity, for compassion. Job asks, is it not enough that God has touched me? If God is sifting Job, and with great severity, does God really need the help of his friends to do more and greater harm to Job? Job asks. Job asks rhetorically, why do ye persecute me as God and are not satisfied with my flesh? If God has taken his pound of flesh and he judges perfectly, why must his friends continually add to God's judgment? Can they not be satisfied that Job has suffered enough under the heavy hand of God's wrath? We come to our fourth point. Verses 23 through 27, Job's wish, belief, and desire. And many people believe that these verses are the center of the entire book of Job. They are by far the most important words ever uttered by Job. And we'll look at these now. Verses 23 to 27, Job's wish, belief, and desire. Verses 23 and 24. Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were written even in a book and graven with an iron pen in lead or in stone forever. Here we begin with Job's wish. We must put these verses into their proper context. Job has tried everything that he can to get God to publicly admit to his friends that he is an innocent sufferer. He has tried every way to draw God into a conversation. And while he has overstated his misery, for the most part, Job has spoken truthfully concerning God. For the times that he has let his emotions get the better of him, he must be excused due to the extreme circumstances. Job has tried to involve God in the debate by calling God his enemy, chapter 6, 10, 13, 16, 19. He has claimed that he would never see good, chapter 7, verse 7. That he will soon be dead on account of God, chapter 7, 21, 10 and 16, chapter 10 and 16. That he will be murdered by God, chapter 12, 15 and 16, 18. That God has overpunished his case in chapters 9 and 12 and 13. And that God will never vindicate him while he is alive, chapter 9 and chapter 13. Job eventually states that he was confident that God would eventually acknowledge his innocence, chapter 13, verse 16. He had hopes of entering into a dispute with God, chapter 13, verse 3 and verse 22, and even winning vindication while he was still living. But in the end, God was silent to all of Job's pleas, and Job was left to argue his case alone. Now Job, having received no alliance in his cry for help from God or his friends, says that he wishes that his case could be written down. He says, "Oh, that my words were now written." Job accepts he will receive no wise judgment from his friends. But he believes that if his case could be written down, and look what he says, with an iron pen in lead, in stone, forever. For every generation to see, in other words. Then some future age might see his arguments surpass the wisdom of his friends. Some future generation might come to see his innocence. And here are those big verses. Verses 25 to 26, Job says this, "For I am sure that my Redeemer liveth, and he shall stand the last on the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet shall I see God in my flesh, whom I myself shall see, and mine eyes shall behold, and none other for me, though my reins are consumed within me." Now we come to this verse for which the book of Job is most famous. Here, out of the blue, Job assures his friends with unshakable confidence of his belief that his Redeemer liveth. The Hebrew word for Redeemer is goal, here translated Redeemer. And this is the word used throughout the Old Testament to refer to a close relative that pays the debt of a close kinsman. Let me explain. There were multiple roles of an Old Testament Redeemer. Multiple roles. He was to pay the debt of a deceased relative, Leviticus 25:25. He was to revenge his death, Numbers 35:12. And he was to maintain his name and honor by raising up his children in his own name, chapter 25:5. So this is an actual office performed by a human in the Old Testament, the office of Redeemer. It is best to understand these verses, here said by Job, in two senses. In the first sense, Job is saying that although his friends will never acknowledge his innocence, a time will come when someone, a Redeemer, and in Job's mind he might just be thinking a normal human, will. The opinion of his friends, he says, will not last forever. Eventually, Job says his Redeemer will come. Job declares that at some point in time, because it is against God's nature to leave the innocent to appear guilty, someone will take up the office of Redeemer on his behalf. While no one living seems willing to perform that function, he must therefore leave it to some future Redeemer. The second sense in which we should understand this verse is that Job is speaking prophetically. Just as David oftentimes spoke clearly of some future aspect of Christ without knowing the full extent of what he said, so also Job here speaks unknowingly but very clearly about the future role of Christ as our Redeemer. Although Job lived in the days of Abraham, and though he possessed no scripture except what oral tradition concerning God was passed down through his ancestors, these words promote advanced thought concerning the future coming of Christ in great detail. Job was, of course, still in the dark about the details of the coming of Christ. But Job, like David in the Psalms, spoke more than he knew. Many have taken this text only metaphorically, but that is a huge mistake. A text in the Scriptures must first be taken literally, especially if it fits other texts. And this verse not only fits other texts, it is the theme of the entire Scriptures. So it's to be taken metaphorically in one sense, but it's also to be taken literally, absolutely. Job details the Redeemer as God, you'll notice. For this Redeemer will not die, as opposed to his accuser friends. This Redeemer, he says, lives even now in the days of Job, but will one day walk the earth like a man. Notice it says, stand on the earth, which is, of course, referring to Christ's incarnation when he took on human flesh. Job also prophesies that though his body would rot in the grave, he says, worms destroy this body, yet he would see God face to face. This prophecy calls forward the hope of the resurrection, where Job, upon death, will not only see God, but will see God in his own flesh, which occurs only after the return of Christ, when our bodies are reunited with our souls. We might also notice that Job might be referring to the old practice of a redeemer who pays the debt of a dead man. Job, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, speaks of Christ who assumes the role of our Redeemer. In the Old Testament, the Redeemer would pay the debt of the deceased. This, of course, is an elaborate picture of how Christ paid our debt when we die. This debt would always be paid, you'll remember, by the nearest relative, which is why Christ calls himself our nearest relative, kinsman, brother. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11, notice where it says, he is not ashamed to call us brethren. He is our closest relative and our Redeemer as our closest kinsman. So here, under the inspiration of the Spirit, Job gives us an advanced picture of the future role of Christ all the way back to what Matthew Henry thinks is probably 1520 BC. We come to our last and final brief point. Verses 28-29, Job again addresses his friends. 28 and 29. But he said, but ye said, this is Job talking to his friends, but ye said, why is he persecuted? And there was a deep matter in me. Be ye, you friends, afraid of the sword, for the sword will be avenged of wickedness, that ye may know that there is a judgment. Job here makes a last address to his friends. Job says that they should ask themselves why they're persecuting him. Job says that he is no hypocrite, and soon, and he does not know how soon, he will be vindicated. Although Job is considered the hypocrite, he says that personally his conscience is clear. He has no fear of judgment, but welcomes it. He knows he has a Redeemer. His friends, however, should be the ones to fear judgment, because very soon they will be the ones that are about to be questioned by God. Job warns that his friends' unrighteousness and uncharitable judgment is about to be called by God to the table. He warns there will be a time of judgment when men will be called to account for their false and harsh words and for the misjudging of a righteous brother. They should not expect to